Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. Hugh, over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on perfecting government contracting contract proposals. I'm Hugh Murphy, Senior Vice President at Leadership Connect, and really excited to moderate this webinar on such an important topic. We're also thrilled to once again partner with our friends at Voltron for this event. Hopefully, some of you were able to join us a few weeks ago for our webinar on mastering the early stages of government contracting, and this will be a great follow-on to that discussion. So over the next hour or so, we'll touch on several topics, obviously proposal development, also, the understanding federal expectations, compliance and risk mitigation, collaboration and partnerships, and current and future trends in government contracting. So in addition, we'll be asking the audience for participation by sharing a few poll questions throughout this session, so keep an eye out for those. But now it's my pleasure to welcome our outstanding panel. First, we have Nora Bashur, Senior Director of Growth at Voltron and our partner for this event. Next, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Jochum, partner in the government contracts practice at Blank Rome. And finally, please welcome Harrison Smith, Acquisition Innovation Advocate from FDIC. Just like to make note that as a federal employee, Harrison's comments are his own and do not relate to any specific awards or proposals. But welcome again to all of you. I'm really excited for today. Why don't we get started just having each of you provide us with a brief overview of your background and anything else you'd like to share with the audience today. Maybe Nora, do you want to get started?
Sure, I'd love to. Good to see you, Hugh. So I'm really excited to be here today. Welcome to everybody joining the webinar. Before joining Voltron early this year, I spent several years on the federal contractor side. So prior to that, my area of expertise was in healthcare, specifically technology adoption and design and development of telemedicine clinical care programs. On the federal contractor side, I started in contract compliance and administration. Then I made my way across to program management and then ultimately BD and a little bit of capture along the way. Throughout that journey, I've written more than my fair share of proposal, and I developed kind of this strange affinity for the kind of crazy complex world that we know and love of federal contracting. So it's a privilege to be here with all of you, and I'm really excited to hear what Elizabeth and Harrison have to share today. Thank you.
Thanks, Nora. Elizabeth, you want to go next?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. I'm Elizabeth Jochum. I'm a partner in the government contracts group of the law firm Blank Rome. In that capacity, I do a lot of government contracts related litigation. So bid protests, for example, assisting with disputes between contractors and their government customers when, God forbid, that's necessary, disputes between contractors and their teaming capacity. And then also do a lot of counseling for government contractors on how to navigate this regulatory world, how to form strategic teams, mentor protege agreements, subcontractor relationships, that type of thing, and advise sort of strategically government contractors in their growth, including M&A activity when they deem that necessary. So particularly in the bid protest context, I have the opportunity to see a lot of proposals, even proposals for the same procurement. Similarly to Harrison, I will not, of course, because of the protective orders, be discussing any of those specific proposals. But you certainly do learn a lot when you have the opportunity to see, what works, what drives award, what are the pitfalls when you're drafting these proposals, and how can you avoid having to see me and have to engage us to get your way in there. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Harrison?
No, thanks for having me. And Elizabeth, we can riff off Rule 9 files and the like. My most recent position is as the Acquisition Innovation Advocate here at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. I've been here for a little more than a year. Last year, my previous position was with the Internal Revenue Service, where I was on the program side as the head of enterprise digitalization, as well as the Deputy Chief Procurement Officer there. Before that, I was primarily in operational contracting for roughly 2 decades. I hate to say that, but there you are, where I dealt with 1 or 2 protests in my time. and saw, significantly sort of large number of protests. Saw a lot of proposals themselves. I think just amongst two sets of efforts that I saw within the Department of Homeland Security when I was running the Enterprise Acquisitions Division, we saw over 1,000 proposals from about 400 firms. So again, seeing sort of that consistent solicitation and not always consistent responses has provided me the perspective that will hopefully prove helpful and maybe even interesting. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I guess we can just jump right in. I thought we could start with discussing federal expectations. And Harris, maybe we can start here with you. I know you just mentioned in our call the other day, you shared how you personally reviewed thousands of proposals across your career. What are some of the key components that federal procurement officials look for in a successful government contract proposal?
So, thanks for that, Hugh. And I want to respond first by telling a very, very brief story that hopefully will resonate pretty quickly. When I was in school, I was getting my master's degree, and I wrote by far the best paper I had ever written. It was well researched. It was structured in a logical fashion. I made coherent arguments, supported them with facts from primary sources. I was excited. I was like, I've got this down pat. When the day came for those papers to be returned, again, no comments about my age and how they were returned, by hand. But there was a quick note that was scribbled on the top. It's like very well structured, theses backed by empirical research and primary sources, solid progression and compelling argument. Fantastic paper. C-. And the little footnote was, you didn't answer the question. And I was like, yep. And looking back at it, I had to frankly agree. And so the correlation here to proposals, from my experience, is that very frequently the passion and the time and the enthusiasm is evident. But just as frequently, there are stories that are being told that are not pertinent to what the government is asking for. Contracting officers and technical evaluators are reviewing reams of paper. If you're writing 75 pages, and I'll use a specific example that's publicly available information, and we're reviewing 666 proposals from 216 firms, I don't know what the math is, but it's a lot of paper. Even for COs, cores, and PMs, reviewing proposals is not what we do on a day-to-day basis. You've made the proposal sing. Your approach is fantastic. It's logical, it's coherent as far as you're concerned, and you've spent endless hours on it. And if you're a proposal manager or PM, trying to drive, frankly, revenue for the firm, this is kind of what you do in and out. But you've got to answer the question in a logical and coherent fashion. It is virtually impossible to be too direct. If the government is asking whether or not cookies are better than cookie dough, the cookie dough is much better than cookies camp. That's me, right? But don't talk about Julia Childs and the best way of making cookies and how, what your favorite cookie is, or how your firm's cookie and cookie dough are better than everybody else's. You could say this eloquently, you could support this with facts, but you're not answering my question. And one of the things that I'll share, that is at least in the back of CO's minds, in the back of source selection authorities' minds, is that from their perspective, right, you've spent hours and hours and hours on your proposal. Similarly, the government team has spent hours and hours and hours on the solicitation and the evaluation framework and all of these things. If we put this out and are saying, hey, we want your proposal for a $500,000, $5 million, $50 million requirement, I think that I've made the requirements very clear. And if you can't follow instructions, why am I going to trust you with $500,000, $5 million, $50 million? That may not be fair, but just take a look at it from that perspective and be very, very precise and very direct about answering the question as it has been asked. Those are some of the basic challenges. It sounds simple, but it's really hard to do in an implementation. That's just some of my thoughts here.
That's really insightful. Thanks, Harrison. I guess, Nora, Elizabeth, anything you'd like to add from from your experience? Oh, actually, I think we have the first poll question popped up here, so let's let everyone address that first, and we can resume from there.
Sure.
Hugh, I'm a little disappointed that I can't vote, but I get it. I
Yeah,
understand.
if it makes you feel better, Harrison, I can't either. So,
I see a couple of things there.
So it's all of the above.
Yeah,
So-
yeah.
right. I think it's all the
Yes.
above, and I think we're going to touch on all of them, despite what despite the responses from the audience. We'll get. I guess
I have some thoughts here. If you, I can't tell if the polling is wrapped up. Oh, there we go. Go ahead.
All right. So, like you said, kind of in line with what you just said, all the above, and I think we've definitely got responses across all of the above. Pretty common across the understanding RFP requirements, demonstrating past performance, managing proposal timelines and resources, and then also a couple of votes for crafting competitive pricing strategy and meeting compliance requirements. Great. So I guess, yeah, Elizabeth, you were going to say?
Sure. So I couldn't agree with Harrison more. One thing that I see often is companies calling me, they're shocked they didn't win. They were absolutely convinced, they had the secret sauce, their proposal was top notch. And then what we find when we look behind the curtain is that they missed the basics, right? They breezed past what was required to go to what was above and beyond what was required. So it's, you have to answer the mail first before you can set yourself apart from the competition, or else, best case scenario, you're not rated as highly as you think. Worst case scenario, you're just kicked out of the competition. And so all that effort is wasted.
I think that sums it up perfectly, because there's two sides of that coin, in that basic compliance, whatever that compliance requirement is, technical, operational, that's a non-negotiable. As soon as we know we can meet those compliance standards, then our minds kind of go strategic, because that solicitation also doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so how are we aligning responsiveness in our technical approach and our compliance to what? And that thing is, and this kind of goes back to the first webinar in this series, we talked about how federal agencies are mission driven. So they tend to want contractors to demonstrate deep understanding of their mission, their initiatives, and that solicitation exists for a reason. So if we think about, okay, compliance is a non-negotiable, we've got that tackled, then what's the purpose of this RFP, and how can we tie into that clearly and directly?
Yeah, thanks, Nora. And I guess maybe as you think about that, we talked a little bit prior about your internal process and sort of how you all collaborate, when you're thinking about developing the proposal and the writing of the proposal. You kind of talked about you have BD and capture kind of out in the field. You have proposal writers. I'd love to hear a little bit from your perspective on how you all collaborate on things internally as you prepare to submit a proposal.
Sure. Do you want me to go first and answer
Yeah,
that?
please. Sorry.
Oh, sure. So I think it's a really, really interesting problem. And I've been kind of studying it for a few months this year, in terms of like, there is this workflow from BD to capture to proposal. And there's that famous kind of industry saying we have of throw it over the fence, right? As soon as BD and capture are quote unquote done, they're pitching information over the fence, and proposal is left trying to, catch that bag. And while we can look at it as a linear process, I kind of look at it again as two sides of the same coin. The work that BD and Capture are doing, they're on the field every day, and it's very experiential. And they're gathering a lot of data over typically a long period of time, and they're connecting the dots. And by connecting the dots, they're taking disparate pieces of information that may not be that meaningful by themselves, but as they connect them, you start getting insights from them. You start being able to derive a strategy from them. And when the proposal hits, the proposal team doesn't have that same luxury of being out in the field every day. They may not have the same SME domain expertise. And so that's where the difficulty comes in solving that throwing over the fence problem. If we could solve it by time or process improvement, it would have been solved by now. But to get that kind of deep experiential and contextual information transferred to proposal teams, that's where the difficulty lies. So we look at both jobs as equally difficult, equally important, and they are two sides of the same coin, because the difference really isn't in capability, it's a difference in their focus. We have seen that problem now across the GovCon industry, regardless of headcount or resources. So it's kind of a big kicker for us in the industry.
Thanks, Nora. And I guess, Elizabeth, how early in the process sometimes do you have clients coming to you and seeking advice, prior to submitting the proposal, as opposed to scrambling after they didn't win and now they're saying, that's not fair, I'm protesting this result? How often do you kind of have the reverse, where you're working with the client to make sure they're meeting those requirements and just putting their best foot forward?
Often. There's kind of 2 points in time where we're frequently engaged. One is when the proposal first the solicitation first drops. They're sorting through, are there ambiguities here? What do these instructions mean? Does this approach that we have in mind comply with the instructions? So there are times where I'll get outreach on that, particularly where something in the solicitation might conflict with the regulation or seem to. This comes up a lot with mentor-protege arrangements. There are small business regulations that govern how agencies can evaluate JVs formed by mentors and proteges, and then we'll see an RFP that seems to conflict with those instructions. So I'll get calls about that. And at that stage, sometimes we're considering solicitation challenge protest, but a lot of times the clients are just looking for advice on how to engage with the government customer to try to resolve these issues short of a protest. So we'll help with drafting Q&A or just CO outreach to try to wade through what is being asked of us and how do we comply with it.
Great. No, that's really insightful. Thanks. And I guess, Harris, I think you already touched on a lot of the common mistakes you see and things like that. Anything else you would offer as it relates to proposals and what makes an effective proposal?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I mentioned at least some of this to start off with, but we can tell when you cut and paste. Like, we can. I had a point, and this was years ago, when I had a firm. It was the type of a solicitation where you could bid in multiple areas, and they flip-flopped the solicitation numbers, and had them on the wrong boilerplate. And that wasn't something that I observed it, right? But what you are working on and how management approach, right? Management approach is frequently a fairly consistent, at least the organizational structure, right? That's frequently very consistent. So, but we understand when there's a cut and paste. What the focus really needs to be on is the content of the solicitation and the requirements that we've identified. I mean, Nora, you made some really great comments around, you've got to meet the first threshold first, right? Usually in adjectival ratings, usually there's an exceeds or an outstanding that says, has met all the requirements or virtually all the requirements and exceeds them in measurable way. Well, you've got to meet the requirements first before you can say, I'm able to exceed them in such a way. And Elizabeth can say this just as well, or perhaps even far better, at least in many circumstances, that I can. There is wide latitude for the government to, even if it reviews and evaluates something incorrectly consistently, there's still a tremendous amount of latitude as to how we make our selections and how we do things. But the piece that I wanted to highlight here is, like Elizabeth noted, if there's an issue with the solicitation, I would very much recommend, whenever you can, be as clear as possible. Sometimes we get questions that just aren't clear. We don't understand what the question is. We understand probably a lot of work went into it. But for instance, if we're talking about unpopulated and populated JVs, or whether or not HubZone mentor protege can use the primes experience. Like, ask the question very directly. Provide us some context. Our hands are frequently tied in spaces that you may not understand. Similarly, like, be on time. If you are late, you are late, you are late, you are late. That's just what it is. Our hands are tied in that case because we have to, in many cases, because we have to be fair. If you think there's inconsistency within the solicitation, you've got to call that out. Do it in writing. And from the governance perspective, and I can appreciate how business strategy might suggest you do otherwise. But if you have a question that you think that you can, that you have a question around a topic where it's inconsistent or it's not clear, and you think you can, said differently, game the proposal in such a way that takes advantage of that, realize that we are going to have trouble evaluating that in a way that will get us to award, in a quick and efficient fashion. If there's something that you're trying to leverage because you're like, oh, I bet that this means that and this means here, and I can be really smart about this. There's a lot of really smart people out there who are trying to do the same thing. Ask the question publicly, however you can. CEOs are human beings. We make mistakes. So asking us in very direct and plain language is really, really helpful. Nora made another great point. Like, what are the goals of the agency? What are the goals of the program? How are these referenced and available, right? Was there an industry day or pre-proposal conference that you can refer to? Use our language back to us. Show us that you've been listening. It's familiar and it's comfortable, and it helps us very quickly point to strengths and, frankly, weaknesses. Like, if you very clearly set forth, like, in the area of, flexibility, configuration, capabilities of a CRM. If you say, here's how much we can configure, here's how it's flexible, here's what we've done in the past, that's really, really helpful when it comes around flexibility and configuration ability of the CRM. Like, be very, very consistent. Your formatting helps with that. The words that you use help with that. Use our language back to us. It really helps us tie it in. And again, it creates a sense of comfort because we know that you have read the solicitation and are trying to respond to it in order. Because we're trying to do the same thing. If we have 15 requirements that are listed, trust me, we're going, did you do A? Did you do green? Did you do 1? Did you do little I? Like, we have to look at that. And so when you do that in order, it helps us understand the information, and it's just an easier read, frankly.
That's really good advice, Harrison. Is something that we deal with a lot is companies feeling like they didn't get credit for something that was in a different section of their proposal than the agency might have expected it to be. First of all, that is a challenging protest ground. I mean, you've mentioned how much discretion there is for agencies to evaluate, but also, why put your customer in that situation? Why risk it, right? I mean, make it easy for them to find what they need to find. I understand, I'm sure we all understand, it's easier said than done. You have page limitations. There are reasons why you're struggling to fit things where they're supposed to go, but you cannot count on the government remembering that in your management section, you address something on technical, or in your key personnel section, you address something on management. It's just, it's not reasonable. It's not fair. And you're not likely to win a protest if you have to go that route.
Yeah. And Elizabeth, if I can, like, on this piece, like, past performance and experience is tough.
Yes.
The number of times that I have heard complaints or seen protests around, you didn't give me credit for this in my experience. That's correct, because you put it in your past performance. And past performance, once you reach that threshold of consistent enough, similar enough, duration, type, complexity, it is how well you did on that effort.
Mm-hmm.
That's the threshold. It's a binary, and then you get into, this is really impressive. You did a lot of good things. You went past and above and beyond the expectations and the needs of the customer and the agency. Like, you have to understand that if it's listed in a particular area, we're probably not going to be able to, unless we somehow provided flexibility, to cite it in a different spot. Now, if we did so inconsistently, that's a different conversation, and Elizabeth's skills become much more helpful in that space when you do it inconsistently. But again, like, bringing back to, If I know as a contracting officer that I'm going to get literally hundreds of proposals that are 10, 20, 100 plus pages long, you submitted late, that's an easy cut. You're out. You missed providing the information in a fashion that showed me you were reading it. Cut it out. And you'll see solicitation language that will go even further and say, if the government receives what it determines to be as excessive marketing materials that do not directly apply to the requirements of the solicitation, it will not be reviewed any further. And these are all these things that are contained within there, which are just saying, help us get to the story that you're trying to tell. Be very consistent about it, be very precise, be very overt. It's one of those things, what is it in sales? Like you have to say something 7 times in order for it to actually stick. Keep that in mind. Your proposal is your sales pitch to the contracting officer. And at the end of the day, that's really the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that we can consider. And it's the only thing that'll improve your chances for getting.
No, that's really interesting. And I think as you're all talking about this, it just highlights how much work and how much resources it takes to even endeavor to propose, submit a proposal on a particular RFP that's out there. And Harris, we were talking yesterday, you kind of posed this kind of question, or that I'd like to pose to you, but if you're a proposal manager, like how would you go about deciding what opportunities to pursue?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for putting me on the spot, Hugh. No, I'm just kidding. It was a great conversation that we had the other day. You've got to be intentional. Similar to what I personally believe is a bad incentive to the number of times that I can meet with a potential customer. It's not really what you're trying to do. The number of proposals that I can generate, it's not really what you're trying to do. You're trying to be able to match up your capabilities, your skills, your team's strengths with what the agency need is. If I don't see that alignment, then I am risking spending what, $5,000, $4,000 a page for the proposal process, and time for the team, gate reviews, white glove, red hat, all these things. You are, I'm not sure wasting time, but you are applying time in a space where you don't have the best perspective on what the government and the agency needs. Now, the flip side of that, of being intentional, right? And this is one of the concerns that comes up quite frequently, like past performance. How does past performance and new entrants, how does that marry in? Past performance, the lack of past performance is, for the FAR, neutral. But neutral doesn't mean it doesn't just mean not bad, it also means not good. It just means nothing. If you are trying to get your foot in the door to an agency that has a very specific technical or programmatic or doctrine-based, background, say Social Security Administration, right? If you don't know this code and the laws and the structures for Social Security Administration, you probably don't want to be, this is just me personally, right? I'm not sure I would go after that. If I can't support in healthcare, Nora mentioned that she was in there at one point in time, healthcare, well, I want to go support Veterans Affairs or HHS. Be careful. Conversely, if somebody is asking for a new perspective, asking for someone to come in with an innovative response, use activities or solutions or technologies or approaches or personnel that come from a different background, that's what they're looking for, then use that to your advantage. Highlight the fact that you don't have past performance with that entity. You have comparable past performance, you have comparable experience. Here are the skills that apply. But agency, you want me, I'm being intentional about this. You want me because I will bring different skills and different approaches and different solutions to the table. And that's what I mean by being intentional. Getting down into the weeds around, okay, great, this is a great alignment. I know this customer well. I have looked at their testimony. I've looked at IG reports. I've looked at OMB memos. I've looked at, just go on down the list. I've got a challenge. I've got a solution that can help address their challenge. That is a very good series of alignments. Or conversely, I know they want a new face. I know they want a new set of skills. I know this is a new program, but be intentional about it. If you don't have that intentionality, and you don't have that context behind, justifying your position, that's where me, and you asked me what my opinion was. Me as a proposal manager, I wouldn't do it unless that aligns. I wouldn't do it. We're wasting too much time and money for people who really want to get a good job done and really want to support an agency. It's just not optimizing that time.
Yeah, I would echo that so strongly, because if that work left of proposal isn't on, kind of nothing you do in proposal is going to make up for that. Not even if you're using AI and other types of tools. I've seen companies wait until that RFP hits to run capture, and like Harrison spoke to, those opportunity costs really add up, because federal proposal development is fairly costly in itself. And then as solicitations become more complex, that resource demand increases. So I strongly second that.
Thanks, Nora. I think we have a second poll question popping up here in a moment. And while everyone has a chance to respond, it'll be a good summary for this. So what is the most critical element for a successful government contracting proposal? Sort of what we just talked about. I think some of these we really touched on: clear and compelling approach, competitive and compliant pricing, strong past performance documentation, team arrangements, accurate compliance regulations. As an example, FAR. So be curious to see what the rest of the audience thinks there and get their feedback via the poll. But I wanted to also just kind of continue on. I know Harris touched on past performance briefly just a moment ago. Nora, do you want to share anything further on past performance and capabilities? I know you had mentioned a little bit about what we've already talked about with, not leaving it to, the reader to determine, but anything you'd like to share regarding how to position your past performance and capabilities?
Yeah, as I was listening to Harrison speak, the thing that came to my mind was evaluators, and Harrison, correct me if I'm wrong, they can't legally infer anything. And he used the word alignment, and that's a word I use a lot: align and connect. So they can't legally infer anything. So you have to spell it out for them, like why it's essential, how whatever the it is, meets whatever it should meet, the agency objective, the mission, the strategic plan. Agencies are mission driven. And this kind of ties back into solicitations don't exist in a vacuum. They're tied to something bigger. So what's that bigger thing? There are things you're going to connect to, which is, again, agency mission, maybe their business model, their environment, their needs, their future direction. Anything that's appropriate that you should connect to, that the solicitation is existing to support, at least like connected to the purpose of the solicitation. I've seen people just ignore the background section and not even pay mind. And that's kind of minimum there. And we're assuming like compliance is taken care of, and your work left of proposal is spot on as well. The things you want to connect from would be anything from, Harrison mentioned management plan, but approach, deliverables, outcomes, innovation. It's the what you do, the how you do it, the why you do it. Your job is to clearly make that connection, so you're not leaving the evaluators kind of on the cliff, because they legally can't do that. And so if you do think ahead to emerging kind of evolving mission needs, and you provide any type of insight or foresight, you also will need to correlate the reason for that risk, because again, you've got to spell it out for them. And then Harrison had mentioned weaknesses, like everybody's got them. If we don't mention them, the evaluation panel still knows we have them, but the smart contractors will talk about how they'll de-risk them. So again, they're making that connection and alignment.
Elizabeth, anything to add regarding past performance? I know we talked a little bit about some examples you've come across in the past where they've, clients have, maybe either misunderstood or misrepresented some of their past performance that doesn't quite align with what their requirements suggest. Do you want to share any examples?
Yeah, it's interesting. Past performance and key personnel jump out to me always as areas where there tend to be very objective requirements or evaluation criteria, which means departing from those puts you at high risk in a protest situation. So for example, if they say they're considering contracts or past performance that goes back 5 years, you've gone outside of that. Even if that doesn't get flagged by the agency, if you're protested, we're finding that. I'm just telling you, it's because it is a box check exercise for us to be looking for those types of things. So it's hard for us to find protest grounds or deal with protest grounds when you're in some of the softer evaluation criteria. But these are areas where, it is a yes or no, are you in or out of the 5-year look back? And so I think, of any of your compliance review, those areas where there are things that are quite objective should be prioritized.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. I guess one final question on past performance real quick. How can small businesses with maybe limited past performance compete effectively in the federal market? This could be anyone who wants to jump in there.
Teaming, right? Teaming is the first thing. And there are ways, I'm sure Harrison and Nora have thoughts, but if a solicitation doesn't permit in its first iteration for you to rely on subcontractor past performance, ask, right? Maybe the agency is amenable to that as a suggestion. And so, expanding beyond federal experience to state, local, commercial is one way. And again, teaming. So a lot of that has to do with front end communication with the government of if you needed expanded beyond, a narrow type of past performance that you might have, just engage in those conversations and proceed from there.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Since you mentioned teaming, I think maybe we'll just jump right into discussing collaboration and partnerships, teaming, et cetera. Nora, do you want to kind of give us some thoughts on how teaming and joint ventures may enhance the strength of a proposal?
Yeah, I mean, teaming is awesome because teaming helps you get more. So there's more opportunities, you can go after more agencies, and it opens more doors. And it sounds great that you're just going to start teaming and let's go ahead and do this. But the interesting thing, I think, is federal procurement hasn't been standing still. Contract vehicles are becoming larger, the work is becoming more complex, and compliance is getting more complex. So everything's becoming more competitive. The advantage that we once had from teaming has become more like a necessity just to stay afloat. So we do say, like, yes, team early, team often, and team with the best. But the other thing that's interesting is even smart teaming can introduce a level of risk. And maybe it's nothing, maybe it's a landmine, but I would encourage folks to work with experts like Elizabeth, because you don't know what you don't know. And so that landmine that you don't see, and I don't mean to steal your job, Hugh, but I'd love to hear from Elizabeth, maybe
Please.
from her experience, some stories or things she could share about that.
Yeah, I mean, the sad reality is everybody's buddies when you're working on the proposal, and then you got to do the work, right? And then, even beyond that, then in 4 or 5 years, you're competing against each other, you're re-teaming. I mean, it's a long relationship that when structured correctly and thought about correctly can be very valuable to both sides. But especially, if you think about the timing of teaming, sometimes it's a sprint, right? So the RFP drops, hopefully you're teaming before the RFP drops, so you're thinking about that. But either way, you're sprinting to try to get your teams together and get your proposal together. So I understand why corners are cut, but unfortunately I see the outcome, right? So you need to think about the relationship, you need to paper the relationship, and make sure that everybody's on the same page. So you're not having breakdowns in the relationship. Sometimes it's as early as right after award, all of a sudden we're in disagreement about our work share that wasn't papered correctly. And then, from there it's performance issues, who's doing what, how many, at every step along the way, there's landmines. So again, it can be navigated, but it takes some front end effort.
Very good. And Harrison, anything else you'd share for contractors that they should be aware of when collaborating with other companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of specific hurdles that you have to address, and I'll give 2 examples. There's different types of teaming arrangements. Well, one of the types of teaming arrangements is being able to utilize and work through another contractor's GSA schedule, GSA contract. Like it's a very specific activity and requires a lot of different parsing of details. I mean, Elizabeth, you brought a couple of them. Like I've actually had calls from firms who have said, I had this agreement. I know you've got the requirement for me to do at least 50% of the work, but I'm struggling with my partners and I don't know how to do this. Like I don't know how to. And I found it a fascinating conversation because it was the first time I'd heard of that, kind of had the curtain pulled back for me in that space. But at the end of the day, my response was, I have privity of contract with you. Like you are the requirements. So being very specific about, hey, if I'm an SDV OSB, I can subcontract with an SDV OSB, and that counts toward my at least 50% requirement. But there's all kinds of different pieces. Another example is things like I was the contracting officer for First Source too, which if you don't know what that is, it's essentially NASA soup for DHS. That's a gross oversimplification of what it is, or what it was, excuse me. And there are challenges around for the NAICS codes and for the requirements of how much actual services a value-added reseller has to provide. And if it's at the task order level, then that restricts how agencies and individual ordering components can utilize it. If it's at the contract level and you don't provide services for the first really big task order that you win, you are going to struggle on the back end. And so you just don't have enough time and money and awards to make that up, and you fall out of compliance with the contract. And then again, you start to get in positions, remember I said, like, our hands are tied? Like, you didn't meet your 50%. You went through a merger and acquisition. You have to recertify. There's no if, and, or buts about it. So establishing that relationship, whether or not it's with potential teammates or competimates or whatever we want to call them, but establishing that relationship with the program manager and the contracting officer to be able to say, hey, you may not be able to tell me anything. You certainly can't provide me with guidance, but these are the kinds of things that are coming up in the program. These are the kinds of things that I'm trying to address. That way, at least we have context. And if we can help, we certainly should be, and I hope we are most of the time. But those specific details around what does it look like? I mentioned unpopulated versus populated JVs. Where is the share of work going to be? You've got to get into those details because, to your point, Nora, like I think it was Nora, you're sprinting to get something done. And you have to make sure that you don't miss major items or take your foot off the gas, to be honest. Because once you've won the contract, that's when the real work begins, right? That's when everything comes down. And you've got to do this work. You got to get to the kickoff meeting. You got to make sure people get cleared and so on and so forth. So you've just got to be able to pay attention to the details and frankly, rely on the expertise and leverage the expertise of partners, support folks and subject matter expertise.
Yeah, Harrison's getting it, and I might be jumping the gun on some of our other conversations, but it's so easy when you're thinking about proposal development and compliance in the context of your proposal to forget that you are going to have to be compliant with the contract when it's issued. So, you mentioned limitations of subcontracting. That's a top one. Mm-hmm. So just, when you're developing your proposal, obviously you want to present the approach that will win. But if that approach will immediately put you in violation of your contract or regulatory requirements, not only does that make your proposal very ripe for protest, but more importantly, you're going to be in violation of your contract right away, day one or month one. So that doesn't help you. It creates a world of hurt for you, for your customer. So it's it shouldn't be a secondary consideration, but in reality, I think process-wise it is. What is your approach to the solicitation? And then if we win, is this approach going to be contractually compliant, regulatory compliant, et cetera?
I think that's such an incredible point that in commercial, you can go after the work and then set up to do it. In federal, you're right. It's in the proposal because you're not just submitting a proposal based on your technical approach. It's your management that you are promising the government that I've got these capabilities in place. I can manage this money well. I can deliver on the business ops that support the delivery of the products or services. And that proposal is your attestation to that. And so you have to have those things in place before you go after the work, and I think that's sometimes, we see companies kind of dupe their corporate biz ops for federal, and there really should be separate legal compliance, contract administration. They're just, federal is such a complex market, that you have to live and breathe it every single day. And I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir now, but like, don't dupe your business ops right on the commercial side for federal, and get it in place before you go after that work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, one of my, this isn't, I say the word trick, but I don't mean it as it sounds. The trick for getting non-federal corporate buy-in for some of this stuff is to have me or someone else come in and use the F word.
Yeah.
Fraud. It is
Yeah.
no joke, because if you say something in your proposal that is not accurate, then in many cases you are committing fraud.
Fraud.
And that is no joke. And it, you know, even if trust me, even an allegation, even a whiff of that will suck your company into a vortex that you cannot escape for years and years. So it's just not worth it. It's, you know, in commercial world, you can puff all you want and be a salesman. In federal, you know, you are making promises to the government, and you need to be able to meet those promises before you make them.
And whatever you misoperationalize will show up in audit. And there's no excuse for, I didn't know, because like OIG, nobody is going to be giving you that hall pass. So whatever you misoperationalize shows up in audit, and having survived audits, they're not for the faint of heart, and they're another complex beast in and of themselves.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on those all fantastic points is I think some people don't fully understand the repercussions of termination for default.
Mm-hmm.
That's the technical term is very much bad. It really has a dramatic impact. And there are some firms who, to be fair, have come back from T4D, or even being debarred. Like there are steps, and this is when I talk about like hands are tied. You know, when you get into the contractual arena, there's some flexibility at times in how the clauses are interpreted and how the requirements, you know, what meets it or what doesn't meet it. A perfect example is award fee. That is far closer to subjective than objective, but that's the nature of award fee. Incentive fees are more subjective. They're frequently gates that are hit. But the point that I'm trying to bring up is that if you are unable to, you know, hold up your end of the bargain, your end of the contract, and you're hoping that you can kind of get through it, you are making the game of chicken all that more complex, which I'm going to now shift to. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't pursue federal work. Please understand that. There's literally just trying to make sure that folks understand it. But if you are fairly new to the game, look for things where other transaction authority, right? Those are for, I mean, technically the term is non-traditional defense contractor, but that's okay. Non-traditional firms that would be in that space. Look for firm fixed price proposals that don't require you to do all things. Do not go after a cost plus as your first. That's far too complicated. See if you can find things that are under simplified acquisition procedures, right? There's certain dollar amounts. FAR Part 13, right? This is essentially the old commercial item test pilot, which has been made permanent. Try to find that sweet spot of where your capability and your familiarity, when combined with, you know, competitive mates, partners, you know, all, you know, senior advisors, like find that sweet spot where it works for you. And again, I go back to be intentional about it. There are absolutely very straightforward ways to do work with the government. You just have to make sure it lines up with your capability and the story that you are working to tell.
Yeah, one quick thought on fixed price. I totally agree with you, Harrison. You know, you can't jump off the diving board into federal contracting with cost reimbursement contracts, no question. But I do think it's worth remembering where the risk lies on a fixed price contract. You know, it's with the contractor. So, and if you think you're gonna come into federal contracts by buying your way into one and lowballing, you know, you have to be able to eat that cost when the overrun happens. So I think there's a lot of that happens where especially, you know, green contractors are not able to perform for the price that they bid, or there's just no coherence between the technical approach that they've proposed and that fixed price. So, and that's, the government may be fully aware of that, but they're going to shrug and say, not my problem. I'm getting that technical approach, and you have to provide it at the price you bid. Now, I'm saying that somewhat facetiously. I think they're aware of some of the risks and consider, but things are not as, I'm sure we're not making them sound easy, but they're not as easy as they seem. And you have to always think about, are we going to be able to perform successfully and meet our contractual obligations?
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into, sort of, you mentioned green contractors and kind of improving on the process. Wanted to pose another question to the audience related to debriefing, and how often does your organization request a debriefing after submitting a government contract proposal? So I'd love to get everyone's feelings there. Do you do it all the time? Never? Sometimes? I think we have a poll question coming up for that. There it is. And I guess while we're awaiting some of the responses, when we were talking about debriefing in our prep call, Harrison, you had mentioned the importance of timing here. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's all kinds of ways to ask. I mean, to be honest, if I'm you again, it is always, I won, still ask for it. There are ways to communicate to, like for instance, if I want a contract, and I wanted to debrief, but I wanted to sort of help things get moved along, and I know that the contract officer was getting a whole bunch of other debriefs, I would wait past the 10 days. It wouldn't be timely. They could therefore provide that they knew that I asked the question, right? They knew that I wanted the debriefing, and it helps them, it helps again to continue to reinforce that partnership. Debriefings, I do want to provide some context here from the government's perspective. Debriefings are times when many contracting officers will feel as though their work is being put under a microscope. And there are times, I will say, unfortunately, when we are told or feel as though contracting officers should only tell you the absolute minimum. There are some agencies, there are some COs who, especially when given the opportunity, will provide you with everything. I was joking with Liz about the Rule 9 file, which is, for those of you who don't know, that is everything in the kitchen sink. That is absolutely everything. There are agencies who pursue providing as much information as they can. We did a major award. We provided your technical ranking. We said, here is the calculation, here's the methodology of the proposals within this area. This is where you fell. You were 47 out of 68. Bing, your price was 27 out of 68. Like that type of information requires a lot of effort from the government. And it requires frankly a lot of trust and a lot of openness. Especially if you are new to this game. Again, leverage the expertise of folks who you're hearing from today. Find the agencies that have industry liaison as a permanent position. Find the agencies, if you're a small business, that have an active OASW office, a small and disadvantaged business utilization. Find the agencies that do pre-proposal conferences. Find the agencies that do, DHS, the strategic industry conversations, that do reverse industry days. These are the agencies that are saying, it is worth my time and energy to provide more than I have to. Because quite frequently, that's not what we have to do. There's a lot of interest in federal dollars for very many reasons. But when you can marry up, I'm talking about the intentionality of this. Marry up what you want to work on, how your experience, how your capability, how your team, how your personnel can support it with the type of work that you're looking for. You want firm fixed price? Understand that the risks exist. You want time and materials? That's different. You want cost reimbursable? Now you really have to make sure that you're able to track things, have an approved cost accounting system if it's over XYZ dollar amount. There's a lot of things to be intentional about here, but there are quite a few large agency partners that have defined full-time industry liaisons. There's a lot of folks who have, very active OASW offices. Find those, ask for their perspective, ask for their help, and frankly, find out what their small business ratings have been. Find out how they're pursuing those things. How important is it to them? That will help you really focus on the potential partnership that you want to develop. I think that's really, really important. Get as much information as you can. And to bring it back to debriefing, again, the amount of information that you'll get at debriefing will tell you what you did well, probably. Will probably tell you what you did poorly. You'll get an idea of what the price was. Like, you'll get all of this sets of information that will, again, inform and better inform you and the team for what you want to pursue next. I think it's incredibly valuable information, and all it requires is, can I have a debrief? Doesn't cost you anything.
That's great. Thanks, Harrison. And I know, Nora, you get this question a lot at Voltron. You said, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, the question I get is, can AI help me evaluate the proposal the way the evaluation panel would? And I give a tongue-in-cheek reply, which is, if I knew how a federal agency evaluation panel would evaluate your proposal, like I wouldn't be working right now. I'd be on my own island somewhere, retired with my staff kind of waiting me hand and foot. And federal work, this kind of ties back to what Harrison just said. It's not something you're going after to pump up short-term earnings. It's this long-term gain. So you're going to have these conversations over time. You've got to collect and analyze and get the insights from this information over time. So if you've had those conversations, even going into proposal, you should have some idea of what those evaluation factors mean. And again, like post submission, sometimes the feedback is hard to read in the moment. Just kind of stick it in your back pocket. You might need more context and more conversations later to make it make sense. But again, it's all that work you're doing outside of proposal, where you're pulling together and synthesizing that information over time, that kind of gives you the insight.
And anything you'd like to add, Elizabeth, as we wrap up on debriefing?
I mean, they're mandatory, in my opinion. Ask for one. It's not even a question. Win, lose, ask for one. This is a conversation I have had with Harrison and, other people in the government. I firmly believe, and I've seen it because of the DoD enhanced debriefing procedures, that more robust debriefs reduce the number of protests. People are more inclined to protest because they do not understand how they could have possibly lost than when they understand why they lost. Even, they may quibble, but at least they can take a breath and say, we missed the mark here, or we just disagree with the agency, and that coin flip is always going to go to the government. The lecture to the agency is, please share, please, be a partner, be a customer, let your contractors grow and learn. And then, of course, my suggestion is just always get one. Worst case scenario, it's not that valuable. Great.
And then I guess we're running out of time here, but maybe just one final question for all of you. Any future trends that you're in government contracting that you'd like to share, if you have any crystal balls?
I wonder if there's going to be a backlash to the giant IDIQs, given how messy they've been over the last couple of years and how many remain mired in protest. But that is a question mark, not a prediction.
Elizabeth, I am shocked that you would bring such a spurious argument. No,
it's my fault. I'm protesting them all. It's my fault. Sorry.
No, I will say it is, and I think in a comparable vein, the self-rating, which I think is a very well-intentioned approach to not have folks waste their time and money. It's the concern that I have with it is when it's crafted in such a way where you're asking for instance, small business input, but I want 6 types of experiences over 5 years with $50 million of each one of the contract action, and the size standard is 16.5 million. Like, the math just doesn't work. Like, we've got to, again, there are ways to get there, but we've got to make sure that what we're trying to do is aligned with the manner in which we're trying to do it. And I think buying smarter, 100%. Buying more consistently, 100%. How we do that and how we allocate our time so that we're frankly not creating an awful lot of churn and money spent within the industry is really important. There's a reason it's called the wrapper. We, the government, just end up paying it anyway. So it's in our best interest to create as much frictionless acquisition, to use that, frictionless acquisitions as we can, because we will just pay in terms of folks who don't want to take their ball and go home because they're tired of playing, folks who spend a lot of time and money and effort on it. I think there's a big challenge here.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think from the industry perspective, there's so many zeros in the Fed's budgets. It's really easy to get blinded by that. And so we have to remember that good financial management is inherent in their roles. And like you talked about, those innovations are going to keep coming. Sometimes they have some unintended consequences, but we're going to continue to see those trends, whatever they may be. And there's always that direct impact on proposal. So those are more conversations you can have too when you're doing your work left a proposal, because you've got to be able to anticipate those and prepare for those operationally.
Absolutely. Well, I can't believe we've blown through an hour this quick. It's already, we're at the top of the hour here. Thank you all so much. I really want to thank our panelists, Nora, Elizabeth, Harrison, very insightful. I hope everyone on the call got a lot of great insight that they can take back to their organizations as well. Thank you all for joining our webinar today. And if anyone did ask a question or two that we didn't get to it, and there may have been one or two we didn't quite answer, we can follow up as a debrief, if you will. But thank you all again, and thank you again to Voltron for helping partner with this event. And I hope you all have a great afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, y'all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.